Imagine you're standing in front of like a giant control board, one of those massive setups that dictates the entire trajectory of the American economy, the legal system, basically everything.
Right. Millions of switches and dials.
Exactly, controlling everything from heavy industry to the social safety net. And usually, an administration walks up to that board, they nudge a dial a millimeter to the left, maybe flip one single switch over 4 years.
Yeah, it's usually fundamentally incremental.
Right. But analyzing these specific White House policy releases, the memorandums, and this really contentious Supreme Court dissent from late May of 2026, the visual is completely different.
It really is. It's a totally different approach.
It's like the administration grabbed this massive, heavy lever labeled, industrial deregulation and corporate innovation and just shoved it all the way to maximum, like shattering the safety glass.
Shoved it right through the console.
Yeah. And then at the exact same moment, they reached over and slammed down this heavy iron button labeled audit, enforcement, and defunding right on top of the social safety net.
Which is fascinating because we're looking at the deployment of two highly forceful, completely diametric mechanisms of state power here.
Two totally different levers.
Exactly. On one side, these May 2026 executive actions, they demonstrate this rapid systemic dismantling of regulatory restraints on heavy industry, nuclear energy, corporate labor forces.
Right. The stated intent in all these releases is accelerating the future and reshoring American dominance. That's the branding.
That's the branding, yeah. But then on the flip side, you have this aggressive, truly unprecedented tightening of the screws on state-level compliance. Things like healthcare funding and Medicaid programs.
So it's like the federal government is acting as a venture capitalist for the industrial sector, but at the exact same time, they're playing the role of a punitive auditor for state-administered social programs.
That is exactly what's happening. And the effects on regular Americans are, well, they're complicated.
So let's start by looking directly at the foundation of this industrial push, which is the workforce. Because on May 27th, the administration put out a release detailing a massive shift in educational and labor policy.
Heavily incentivizing a pivot toward blue-collar skilled trades.
Right. And the data they lead with here is pretty staggering. They claim 60% of Gen Z Americans now plan to pursue skilled trade work this year.
Which is a massive jump. I mean, it was less than 40% just 1 year prior.
Yeah, but the statistic that really jumps out, the one that demands scrutiny, is that half of Gen Z college graduates are actively pivoting to the trades after getting their degrees.
Right, after they already have the degree, which, the cultural and economic messaging for the last 4 decades has been incredibly singular.
Went to college.
Exactly. Obtain a 4-year university degree to secure middle-class stability. Avoid physical labor at all costs.
And this May 27th release explicitly frames that historical push as the, quote, failed college for all experiment.
Yeah, but we really have to look at the underlying mechanics driving this pivot.
Yeah.
Because it's not just some sudden cultural awakening where everyone suddenly wants to be a welder.
Right. It's not just a trend.
No, it's a forced economic correction. The release cites that 94% of U.S. contractors are reporting severe labor shortages.
94%. That's basically everyone.
Basically every contractor in the country. So when you have an entire generation holding degrees in, say, communications or mid-level software development,
which are fields currently facing intense saturation, plus the looming threat of AI automation.
Exactly. They're meeting a labor market that desperately needs people who can physically bend conduit, weld steel, install high-voltage transformers.
I kind of look at this like an over-leveraged financial portfolio.
How so?
Well, as a society, we basically took all of our human capital and invested it into one single asset class, right? The white-collar knowledge worker.
We put all our chips on analysts and consultants?
Exactly. We told everyone to go do that. But we completely forgot to invest in the people who actually physically build the server farms or run the copper wiring or maintain the industrial cooling systems that those analysts rely on every day.
Right. The physical plumbing of the economy is literally breaking down.
But reading through the specifics of the Working Families Tax Cuts Act they mention in the release, I really have to ask, is this a natural market correction? Or is the federal government heavily engineering this?
Oh, they are absolutely engineering.
Under the guise of helping the working class, right? Like, does this actually benefit specific corporate interests more than the workers?
That's the million-dollar question. The administration is heavily engineering the landscape through the tax code. And if you look at the mechanics of who actually benefits, It requires some careful analysis.
So let's break that down. The release highlights the expansion of 529 savings plans.
Right. Historically, a 529 plan allowed wealthy and middle-class families to invest money tax-free,
Right.
but only if it was used for traditional college tuition.
And now the new policy expands that tax advantage status to cover trade certifications and even tools.
Yeah, and they also directed the Department of Education to launch this Workforce Pell Grant program. So they're shifting federal tuition subsidies directly into fast-tracked manual labor training.
Which sounds great on paper. The release also points to the elimination of taxes on overtime pay and the implementation of 100% bonus depreciation for equipment.
Those are the big ones.
Yeah, so if you put yourself in the shoes of, like, a 22-year-old who just started an independent welding business, right?
Okay.
The ability to write off the entire $50,000 cost of a new work truck in year one and then take home every single penny of your overtime pay without federal tax withholding.
Right.
I mean, that sounds like a massive victory for the working class.
It does. It completely alters the economic math of starting a business for that kid.
Right.
It does alter the math for the individual, yes. But the macroeconomic effect, and frankly, the primary beneficiary, it's often the massive corporate contractor.
Okay, wait, how so? Break that down for me.
Yeah. Consider the elimination of the overtime tax. The worker gets more take-home pay, which is obviously highly popular.
Yeah.
Everyone loves tax-free money.
Sir?
However, this policy acts as a massive, almost invisible subsidy to corporate giants. Think Amazon, BlackRock, heavy industry conglomerates who are funding these massive infrastructure projects.
Because they don't have enough workers.
Exactly. Instead of having to do the hard work of hiring, training, and providing health benefits for a whole second shift of workers to meet their labor shortages.
Oh, wow. They can just lean on their existing guys.
Right. They can just ask their existing workforce to work 60 to 80 hours a week. The worker is incentivized to say yes because the overtime is suddenly tax-free.
So the federal government is essentially eating the lost tax revenue to help corporations mask their labor deficits.
Exactly. It's a corporate subsidy disguised as a populist tax break.
That is wild. And I'm guessing the 100% bonus depreciation works the exact same way.
Oh, absolutely. It helps our 22-year-old welder buy a truck, sure. But it allows a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing corporation to write off hundreds of millions of dollars in robotic assembly lines.
Or heavy machinery.
Right. In a single tax year, basically zeroing out their corporate tax liability entirely.
And the release actually explicitly lists major commitments from corporate giants, doesn't it?
It does. Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Home Depot, Lowe's, BlackRock, Carrier Global, they are all, quote, stepping up to fund these new apprenticeship and training programs.
Well, they're stepping up because they are the ultimate consumers of this new labor pool.
Exactly. Amazon requires millions of square feet of new warehouse space.
Yeah.
Google and Meta are locked in this unbelievable artificial intelligence arms race that requires massive, hyperdense data centers.
And you cannot plug in a new robotic supply chain or liquid cool an AI server rack without an absolute army of specialized HVAC technicians and master electricians.
You literally can't. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data cited in the release projects a 9% growth for electricians and more than double the national average growth for HVAC techs.
So the administration is using federal tax incentives to rapidly cultivate a cheap, highly skilled labor force for the technology and manufacturing sectors.
That's the reality behind the policy, yes.
But there's also a very specific exclusionary boundary drawn in this May 27th release. It explicitly notes that new guidance bars illegal aliens from accessing any of these taxpayer-funded workforce programs.
Right. The stated goal there is ensuring benefits go exclusively to American workers.
But from an implementation standpoint, is that a practical enforcement mechanism? Or is it just political theater designed to signal strength on immigration while the heavy industry lobby just looks the other way and hires undocumented labor anyway?
It functions heavily as political theater, primarily because federal workforce grants are already subject to strict citizenship or lawful residency requirements under existing federal law.
Oh, so it was already illegal for them to get these grants.
Exactly. Reissuing guidance that reiterates an existing law generates headlines, sure, but it does not change the reality on the ground at the construction site.
Right.
Subcontractors in the heavy construction and residential building sectors have historically relied incredibly heavily on undocumented labor, often through these complex layers of opaque staffing agencies.
So barring them from a federal Pell Grant doesn't stop them from being hired to pour the concrete for the new AI factories being built under these very same industrial deregulation policies.
Not at all. It's essentially symbolic.
Wow. Okay, so we are training this massive army of welders and electricians to build massive new factories and AI data centers. But a 3 million square foot automated factory or an AI server farm is entirely useless if the local power grid brownouts the second you flip the switch.
Oh, it'll crater the grid instantly.
Right. And wind and solar alone simply cannot provide the dense, uninterruptible baseload power required for heavy industry.
No, they can't. Not at that scale.
So to find the energy source capable of powering this new economy, the administration is basically looking backward to the 1950s.
Yes. The May 22nd remarks by Director Michael Kratsios, he's from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He spoke at the Operation Gigawatt Summit in Utah.
Operation Gigawatt. Subtle.
Very subtle. He outlines a complete foundational rewiring of American energy policy. He was speaking on the one-year anniversary of the administration's executive orders on nuclear energy.
And the focus is entirely on unleashing gigawatts of nuclear power by aggressively dismantling the regulatory bureaucracy.
That is the whole point of the speech, yeah.
Now, Kratsios uses a very deliberate historical framing in his speech, which I found fascinating. He traces the American scientific frontier starting all the way back in 1752 with Benjamin Franklin flying his kite in a thunderstorm to prove the electrical nature of lightning.
Classic American mythology.
Exactly. And then he draws this direct line to 1953 when President Eisenhower delivered his Atoms for Peace speech. Kratsios describes how Franklin's, quote, spiritual heirs used the experimental breeder reactor number 1 outside Arco, Idaho, to light up 4 200-watt light bulbs, officially inaugurating the era of civilian atomic power.
It's a great narrative device. He is painting nuclear energy not as this hazardous liability that we've treated it as for decades, but as the ultimate manifestation of American manifest destiny.
Right. It's very much this is our birthright.
Exactly. And the narrative is designed to highlight the stark contrast with the regulatory stagnation that followed that era. He notes that within 2 decades of Eisenhower's speech, the U.S. had 30 nuclear plants operating and 55 under construction.
We were building them everywhere.
Everywhere. But then, following incidents like 3 Mile Island and the implementation of the linear no-threshold model of radiation safety, the momentum completely died.
Just stopped cold.
The industry became totally stagnant. Perfectly functional reactors were prematurely shut down simply due to compliance costs, and the domestic supply chain for nuclear fuel essentially evaporated, leaving the country dependent on foreign adversaries.
And he puts the blame for this squarely on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC.
He really goes after them.
Yeah, the metrics he provides regarding their previous bureaucratic process are, honestly, difficult to even comprehend. He states that prior to the new executive orders, the average NRC review time for licensing a new reactor took more than 20,000 hours.
Yeah, 20,000 hours.
Just for context for you listening, 20,000 hours is the equivalent of a single person working 40 hours a week with 0 vacations for 10 solid years, just to process one single safety review.
It's mind-boggling.
And the timeline for a combined operating license was taking up to 60 months, 5 years. How does a regulatory body physically generate 20,000 hours of review? What are they even looking at?
Well, the mechanism behind that delay was a regulatory framework rooted in what's called deterministic safety modeling.
Okay, what does that mean?
Historically, the NRC required applicants to mathematically and physically prove that their reactor design could survive every single hypothetical worst-case disaster simultaneously.
Simultaneously, like all at once.
Exactly. So imagine an earthquake, a massive flood, a total loss of off-site power, and an internal mechanical failure, all happening at the exact same moment.
That's absurd.
It is. And the documentation required for this, using really outdated modeling standards, resulted in millions of pages of physical paperwork. What Kratsios is celebrating here is a shift toward a risk-informed, performance-based licensing framework.
Okay, so a more realistic model.
Right. The administration essentially ordered the NRC to stop demanding impossible absolute certainty and to start using modern probabilistic AI models to assess risk.
And the results of that shift, according to the release, are incredibly rapid. They talk about power uprates, which, just for the listener, is the process of getting a license amendment to increase the thermal output and generate more electricity at an existing facility.
Right, tweaking the existing plant to get more juice.
Those are now being approved in under a year. He cites the Robinson plant renewal in South Carolina as the fastest ever license review. The NRC has authorized renewals for 18 reactors, securing nearly 17,000 megawatts of power.
Which is a massive amount of energy.
But the underlying motivation here isn't just, keeping the lights on in residential neighborhoods. It is about technological supremacy, isn't it?
Absolutely. Kratsios explicitly ties this nuclear acceleration to the artificial intelligence race with China and the reshoring of semiconductor fabrication.
Right, because you cannot win a global AI arms race if your domestic data centers consume so much electricity that they destabilize the civilian grid.
Exactly. You'd literally be turning off the power to hospitals to run chatbots. So they need this massive baseload. Furthermore, the administration is treating nuclear energy as a vital national security imperative. The speech details something called the Janus Program, which fundamentally alters the military's relationship with atomic power.
The Janus program, okay, because historically when we think of military nuclear power, we think of the Navy, right?
Right.
We think of nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers that can operate for decades out in the ocean without refueling. What is the Janus program doing differently?
The Janus Program is rapidly advancing the deployment of microreactors directly onto domestic military installations.
On land.
On land, with the goal of U.S. Army oversight by 2028.
Wow, that's fast.
The core issue here is energy resilience. Currently, major domestic military bases rely on the regular civilian power grid.
Which is a huge vulnerability.
A massive one. If a foreign adversary launches a sophisticated cyber attack that takes down the regional civilian grid, the military base goes dark too.
Right.
They end up relying on diesel backup generators with very limited fuel supplies.
Right.
But a military installation equipped with its own self-contained nuclear microreactor is entirely self-sufficient. It island-proofs national defense from civilian infrastructure vulnerabilities.
So they can keep operating even if the rest of the state is completely blacked out.
Exactly.
But this shift in perception is also solving a problem that has paralyzed American politics for, decades. Nuclear waste.
The ultimate political hot potato.
Right. Nobody has ever wanted used nuclear fuel stored in their state. The political deadlock over the Yucca Mountain Repository in Nevada was considered an untouchable third rail.
Career suicide for any politician.
But Kratsios mentions the creation of these nuclear life cycle innovation campuses. And the response from state governments to this is frankly shocking. Since February of 2026, the Department of Energy has received applications from more than 20 states interested in hosting these facilities.
Wild.
And 4 states unequivocally applied to take uncapped and unrestricted amounts of used nuclear fuel. Uncapped.
That represents a seismic cultural and economic shift.
Why are states suddenly begging for uncapped nuclear waste?
Well, it comes down to financial incentives and, honestly, a realization regarding the actual mechanics of dry cask storage. The administration is likely offering massive federal subsidies, infrastructure investments, and job creation to states willing to host these campuses. They are buying compliance.
Again, who benefits? The state gets federal money, the corporate contractors get paid to build the sites.
Exactly. And furthermore, the public is slowly realizing that spent nuclear fuel is not glowing green goo leaking from rusty barrels like in The Simpsons. It is solid ceramic pellets encased in massive concrete and steel casks that are incredibly safe and entirely inert.
So the fear was overblown, and now the money is too good to pass up. They are also looking beyond traditional fission, right? Kratsios notes that the NRC proposed the nation's first ever regulatory framework for fusion machines.
Yes, which is a huge leap forward.
Just to clarify the mechanics for everyone listening, traditional nuclear power is fission, which involves taking a really heavy atom like uranium and splitting it apart to release heat. That's what creates the long-lived radioactive waste we just discussed.
Right.
Fusion is the exact opposite. It involves taking light atoms, like hydrogen, and smashing them together at extreme temperatures, literally replicating the exact process that powers the sun.
And it generates massive amounts of clean energy with zero long-term radioactive waste.
It has always been the holy grail of physics. Always 10 years away.
Always 10 years away, right? But by establishing a regulatory framework for fusion before commercial fusion even exists, the administration is signaling to private venture capital that the United States is open for business.
They are preemptively removing the regulatory friction to ensure that when fusion is achieved, it is commercialized here in America, not in Europe or China.
Exactly. It's a purely economic and geopolitical play.
But building this domestic fortress of high-power, heavy industry is only half the equation, right? You cannot build advanced microreactors, AI server farms, and 6G telecommunications networks entirely on your own.
No, the supply chains are global.
You need secure supply chains for the physical hardware, and you need to control the international standards that govern the software. You need a closed-loop operating system with trusted nodes.
And that brings us to the May 22nd Memorandum of Understanding between the governments of the United States and Sweden, officially titled the Technology Prosperity Deal.
Now, if you are trying to build a secure global operating system for physical infrastructure, you do not partner with everyone. You carefully select a partner with specific capabilities.
Right.
It's like you're building an Avengers team, and you need...
A very specific specialist. Exactly.
Yeah, you look at the map and realize you need advanced telecommunications expertise, and you need a highly strategic geographic position in the Arctic. Sweden provides both.
They absolutely do. The areas of cooperation outlined in the text of the MOU are highly specialized. They include artificial intelligence, 6G telecommunications networks, biomedical research, advanced manufacturing, nuclear energy, space exploration, and quantum computing.
It's basically a checklist of every futuristic technology.
Yeah, and the text states the purpose is to fortify freedom and prosperity and to strengthen stability, security, and competitiveness.
Which sounds very nice and diplomatic.
But when you actually analyze the specific mechanisms of the agreement, it reads less like a traditional trade deal and much more like the architecture for a digital and physical iron curtain designed to lock out foreign adversaries.
Wow, an iron curtain. Let's look at the telecommunications aspect, because that seems to be a massive focal point. The document talks extensively about building a trusted, interoperable 5G supply chain and advancing joint research on the upcoming 6G networks.
Yes.
To understand why this matters, we have to look at what a trusted technology stack actually is. A technology stack is essentially the layers of a system, right? The physical hardware like the cell towers and routers, the firmware that runs them, and the software applications on top.
Right, and the vulnerability is at the bottom.
Exactly. If an adversarial nation manufactures the physical hardware, they can embed backdoors at the hardware level that no software update can ever secure.
And Sweden is vital here because it is home to Ericsson, which is one of the few global telecommunications giants capable of providing a complete end-to-end alternative to state-backed competitors from nations like China.
So we need them.
Desperately. The MOU explicitly outlines a strategy where the U.S. and Sweden will partner to promote the global diffusion of these trusted technology stacks. They are even committing to use U.S. and Swedish export financing to subsidize the cost.
Wait, so our government is going to pay to make Swedish tech cheaper for other countries?
Exactly. Making it financially viable for third-party countries in the developing world to choose Swedish hardware over cheaper, subsidized hardware from strategic rivals.
That's a massive corporate subsidy for Ericsson, basically funded by the American taxpayer in the name of national security.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And they're also combining forces to write the rules of the future internet. The MOU mandates coordinated engagement in international standards bodies like the International Telecommunication Union.
Right, specifically aligning their positions ahead of the 2027 World Radio Communication Conference.
Because if you control the international standards, you dictate how every piece of hardware on Earth communicates.
It's unbelievable leverage. And the coordination extends heavily into the physical realm as well. The MOU details an initiative to strengthen connectivity by supporting the establishment of subsea fiber optic communication cables across the Arctic.
And they are expanding this protective posture into space, too.
Right. The Strengthening Space Collaboration section outlines partnerships on human space exploration, explicitly noting potential collaboration on the future Artemis lunar surface missions.
They are tying Swedish scientific expertise directly into the American industrial base.
But the language used in the biomedical and manufacturing sections reveals the true defensive nature of this agreement. Under the biomedical research section, it discusses addressing antimicrobial resistance, but it immediately pivots to a mandate for advancing innovation to strengthen resilient supply chains, including through identifying choke points and reducing reliance on adversary-linked supply chains.
Yeah, adversary-linked supply chains is the critical phrase there. The administration is openly acknowledging a severe vulnerability.
What's the vulnerability?
If a global crisis or conflict erupts tomorrow, the United States is currently deeply reliant on strategic rivals for the active pharmaceutical ingredients required to synthesize basic antibiotics.
We don't make our own medicine.
Not the base ingredients, no. And we also rely on them for the rare earth metals necessary to manufacture advanced batteries, fighter jet displays, semiconductor fabrication equipment. We are totally exposed.
So the MOU creates a joint task force to engineer rare earth-free materials and high-performance alloys to break those foreign monopolies.
Right, it's defensive maneuvering.
And the agreement goes even further in a section dedicated to strengthening security in research and industry. It mandates enhanced disclosure of foreign funding and government-backed research, and it establishes talent integrity safeguards to prevent partnerships with what they call entities of shared security concerns.
They are actively building a wall around their intellectual property.
If you are listening to this right now, this MOU dictates the security of the 6G network your phone uses, the origin of the antibiotics you take, and the underlying architecture of the digital economy.
It really is a massive, coordinated acceleration of industrial and technological power. The federal government is writing blank checks, deregulating industries, and signing international treaties to ensure American dominance.
Mostly benefiting the huge corporate players who hold the contracts.
Exactly. But here is the severe contradiction in the documents we are analyzing today. While the administration is operating with zero restraint to fund the industrial sector and the wealthy corporate contractors building it,
Right.
they are simultaneously deploying a financial guillotine domestically against state-level social safety net programs.
Yeah, this is the pivot. The May 26th White House release regarding the task force to eliminate fraud. It outlines an enforcement crackdown that is just staggering in its scale and severity.
Massive.
The administration frames this as a full-scale war on fraud, describing it as a moral imperative to recover billions looted from taxpayers. But the numbers suggest a systemic dismantling of access to federal programs for everyday Americans.
Let's look at those numbers. The Department of Justice confirmed it has 8,000 active ongoing fraud cases.
8,000.
The task force uncovered $6.3 billion in suspected fraudulent government contracts, and the Small Business Administration referred 562,000 pandemic-era loans, totaling $22 billion for aggressive collection.
Now look, the $22 billion in pandemic loan fraud represents a massive failure of previous oversight, obviously. And prosecuting those cases is a standard government function. Nobody is saying you shouldn't go after fraud.
Right, but the enforcement actions detailed in the release go far beyond standard prosecution.
Yeah.
They are employing what can only be described as a sledgehammer approach.
Specifically targeting state-administered healthcare programs like Medicaid and Medicare in certain states like California and Minnesota.
Yeah.
The document details that in Los Angeles alone, over the course of a few weeks, the administration suspended 447 hospices and 23 home health agencies, citing estimated fraud exceeding $600 million.
In just one city.
And in Minnesota, the DOJ served criminal warrants on dozens of child care centers and businesses suspected of SNAP fraud, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and they charged individuals in the largest autism Medicaid fraud scheme ever prosecuted.
Okay, to understand why the federal government is stepping in so aggressively, we really have to look at how this specific type of healthcare fraud operates, because it is insidious.
Walk me through it. How does hospice fraud work?
Organized hospice fraud is incredibly lucrative and systematic. A criminal ring sets up a shell company, often operating out of a strip mall or just a residential home.
Okay.
They hire an unscrupulous medical director for a kickback. They then pay recruiters to go into low-income senior housing and offer residents a small, a monthly cash payment to sign a medical form they do not understand.
Oh my God.
That form fraudulently certifies them as terminally ill and enrolls them in hospice care.
Even though they aren't dying.
Right. The shell company then bills Medicare for continuous home care at maximum daily rates, sometimes over $200 a day per patient, for services that are literally never provided.
That is insane.
Multiply that by hundreds of fake patients, and a single organized ring can steal millions of dollars a month.
That is undeniably egregious. And it drains resources from actual patients who need the care. But we must analyze the mechanism the administration is using to stop it, and who actually suffers the consequences of these executive orders.
Right, the real-world effect.
The text states the administration deferred $1.3 billion in federal Medicaid reimbursements for California, demanding the state overhaul its oversight. They halted nearly $260 million in Medicaid payments to Minnesota.
And then the big one.
Yeah, most severely, on May 13th, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services halted all new Medicare enrollments for hospice providers nationwide until the fraud crisis is brought under control.
This is where we must assess the actual impact of the executive orders versus their stated intent. Halting all new Medicare enrollments for hospice providers nationwide is the nuclear option of regulatory power.
It is entirely indiscriminate.
Totally. While it temporarily stops the fraudulent shell companies from enrolling new fake patients, it completely devastates the legitimate healthcare ecosystem.
If you are a legitimate group of palliative care doctors in Ohio or Texas who just spent 2 years securing licensing and funding to open a new hospice facility to serve your community,
You are suddenly locked out of the Medicare system. You cannot operate. You cannot take patients.
and the collateral damage falls entirely on the most vulnerable people in the country. Terminally ill patients who legitimately need end-of-life care are faced with reduced access and shrinking options because the federal government decided to freeze the entire national system to score a political victory on fraud enforcement.
It's like freezing every bank account in the city just to catch a few bank robbers.
Exactly. And deferring $1.3 billion in Medicaid to California doesn't hurt the wealthy fraudsters who already stole the money and hid it in offshore accounts.
No, they're long gone.
It hurts the low-income families, disabled individuals, and pregnant women who rely on state Medicaid clinics that suddenly find their federal funding frozen. The federal government is using the power of the purse to inflict maximum pain on state governments until they comply with federal investigative demands.
It really is a sledgehammer. And the operational reality of executing 8,000 active fraud cases requires an immense deployment of federal agents, prosecutors, and local law enforcement.
Right. The May 26 release notes the establishment of a new National Fraud Enforcement Division and a West Coast strike force team.
This is a massive expansion of federal policing power directed entirely inward at domestic social programs.
And the human cost of this enforcement push is quietly acknowledged in a separate document. On May 28th, just 2 days after the massive fraud release, the White House signed H.R. 3497, the Medal of Sacrifice Act of 2025. This legislation establishes a new national medal to honor eligible law enforcement officers and first responders who are killed in the line of duty.
It serves as a stark reminder that behind the billions of dollars in deferred funding and all the political theater and rhetoric about eliminating fraud, there are actual individuals carrying out these dangerous warrants and conducting these investigations.
Yeah, real human consequences. The federal government has clearly demonstrated its willingness to use financial extortion, withholding billions in Medicaid, to force states to comply with federal anti-fraud standards.
But what happens when the mechanism of financial leverage fails?
Right. What happens when a state fundamentally disagrees with a federal mandate regarding public safety and immigration and simply refuses to comply?
That brings us to the final and arguably the most constitutionally explosive document in our analysis today.
The May 26th Supreme Court dissent, written by Justice Clarence Thomas, joined by Justice Samuel Alito in the case of Florida v. California and Washington.
This document reads less like a standard legal opinion and more like a warning of an impending structural collapse of the American Republic.
It really does. It's incredibly intense. To understand the legal theory here, we first have to look at the devastating factual narrative laid out in the dissent.
It's a tragedy.
On August 12, 2025, a man named Harjinder Singh was operating an 80,000-pound commercial tractor trailer on the Florida Turnpike.
Okay.
He approached a sign clearly indicating that U-turns were prohibited and that the turnaround area was for official use only. Singh attempted the illegal maneuver anyway. His massive trailer swung across both lanes of the high-speed highway. A minivan traveling behind him had no time to stop and crashed into the trailer. All 3 passengers in the minivan were killed instantly.
It's awful. And Singh was arrested for vehicular homicide.
He was. But the ensuing investigation revealed a complete systemic failure of federal law at the state level.
Right, because how did he even have a license?
Exactly. The document notes that Singh was an Indian national who had crossed the border illegally. He likely could not read the English road signs. Following the crash, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration tested his English proficiency, and he failed completely.
He couldn't answer basic verbal questions.
He could identify only 1 out of 4 standard highway signs.
So the issuance of his commercial driver's license, or CDL, represents a direct collision between federal safety mandates and state-level political directives.
Right. Because federal law is unequivocal on this matter. The statutes cited in the text strictly prohibit states from providing a CDL to any applicant who cannot sufficiently understand the English language, read traffic signs, and demonstrate lawful immigration status.
Obviously. Operating an 80,000-pound machine requires absolute adherence to standardized safety protocols.
So how did an individual who failed the federal requirements secure a license?
Well, the text reveals that Singh failed his driver's test at least 10 times in Washington state and at least once in California.
10 times.
10 times. Yet both states eventually issued him commercial licensing. A footnote in the dissent states that Washington later admitted it had, quote, erred in licensing him, along with 685 other non-citizens.
They just admitted it was an error.
Yeah, and California claimed it issued him a short-term non-domiciled CDL, but under federal rules, he still entirely lacked the required valid work authorization to hold that license.
So the mechanism of this failure is rooted in state sanctuary laws, right?
Exactly. States like California and Washington have enacted local laws that explicitly forbid state employees, including DMV clerks, from inquiring about an applicant's immigration status.
So when a state political directive forbids asking about legal status, the federal safety mandate requiring proof of lawful presence is functionally erased right at the clerk's desk.
Yes, the federal government attempted to address this. The text mentions a February 2026 action by Transportation Secretary Sean P. Duffy finalizing a rule to stop unqualified foreign drivers, explicitly citing systemic noncompliance in states like California.
But the state of Florida, having suffered the fatal consequences of California and Washington's noncompliance on its own highways, did not want to wait for a Department of Transportation memo.
No, they wanted blood.
Florida attempted to sue California and Washington directly in the United States Supreme Court. They filed a motion seeking permission to file a bill of complaint. They argued that by ignoring federal commercial licensing standards, California and Washington were creating an actionable public nuisance that exported deadly hazards onto Florida's roads.
And this is where the constitutional crisis ignites.
Because the Supreme Court denied Florida's motion to hear the case, providing absolutely no explanation, they just simply shut the door.
Which is wild. This summary denial is what provoked Justice Thomas's furious dissent. His argument relies entirely on the mechanics of Article 3 of the Constitution.
Let's unpack that. Justice Thomas points out that Article 3 dictates that the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction in all cases in which a state shall be a party. Congress further codified this with a statute 28 U.S.C. section 1251, which declares that this original jurisdiction is exclusive in all controversies between two or more states.
Let's explain exactly what exclusive original jurisdiction means in practice for anyone listening.
Go ahead.
It means that if the state of Florida wants to sue the state of California, Florida cannot file a lawsuit in a state court in Tallahassee. They cannot file a lawsuit in a federal district court in Los Angeles. The United States Supreme Court is the single exclusive judicial forum on the entire planet that is legally authorized to hear a dispute between two sovereign American states.
It's the only venue.
The only one.
So Justice Thomas's argument is that because the Supreme Court holds a total monopoly on this jurisdiction, they have an absolute non-negotiable constitutional duty to hear the case.
Exactly. He quotes Chief Justice John Marshall from 1821, stating, "We have no more right to decline the exercise of jurisdiction which is given than to usurp that which is not given."
Meaning you can't just pass the buck. If the Supreme Court refuses to hear the case, Florida literally has nowhere else to go. They are denied any judicial remedy for the deaths of their citizens.
Now, the Supreme Court has historically utilized a discretionary approach to original jurisdiction cases. This means the court decides whether the issue is sufficiently serious to warrant their time, often citing the need to manage their docket and focus on appellate work.
We're too busy, basically.
Right. But Thomas violently rejects this discretionary standard. He argues that docket management does not override a constitutional mandate. Furthermore, he argues that even if you apply the discretionary standard, this specific dispute is of such profound magnitude that the court is obligated to intervene.
And Thomas uses language that is, frankly, shocking for a judicial document. He states that if the states were fully sovereign nations, this dispute over one state exporting unqualified, dangerous drivers into another state's territory would amount to a casus belli.
Yes, a casus belli, which is a Latin diplomatic term that translates directly to an act or an event that provokes or is used to justify a war.
A cause for war.
The use of casus belli is not hyperbole here. It is a precise legal analogy regarding sovereignty.
So imagine two completely autonomous nations that share a border. The upstream nation decides to ignore international environmental treaties and dumps massive amounts of toxic waste into a shared river. The citizens of the downstream nation die from the contamination.
Okay.
The downstream nation attempts to take the dispute to the designated international tribunal, the only body authorized to prevent violence. If that tribunal simply refuses to hear the case without explanation, the downstream nation is left with only two choices: accept the deaths of its citizens or declare war to stop the harm.
Exactly. When the states ratified the Constitution and entered the Union, they explicitly surrendered their right to raise armies, wage war, or enact economic blockades against their neighboring states.
They gave up that power.
They surrendered their sovereign right to self-help in exchange for the guarantee that the Supreme Court would act as the peaceful, binding referee in any disputes between them.
So Thomas is warning that by refusing to hear the case, the court is breaching the fundamental contract of the Union.
Because if the Supreme Court abdicates its role as the referee, it forces these state versus state conflicts out of the judicial realm and entirely into the political and executive realms.
Which means the only mechanism left to hold a state accountable for violating federal law is the exact type of sledgehammer executive action we saw in the fraud documents.
Right. The federal government weaponizing the power of the purse, freezing billions of dollars in essential health care and infrastructure funding to extort compliance.
And that reality brings our entire analysis today full circle.
It really does.
Looking at this stack of May 2026 documents, we are witnessing a federal executive branch operating at maximum unrestricted intensity across every conceivable front, utilizing every lever of power available to reshape the nation.
They are aggressively deregulating and subsidizing the corporate future. They're rewriting the tax code to provide billions in write-offs to heavy industry, steering a generation of young people away from higher education and into blue-collar labor to build massive AI data centers.
They're dismantling the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to fast-track microreactors for the military.
And drafting international treaties with Sweden to monopolize global telecommunications infrastructure. They're acting as the ultimate venture capitalist, heavily favoring wealthy corporate contractors under the guise of an industrial renaissance.
But simultaneously, they are ruthlessly auditing and squeezing the present, deploying strike forces to root out social safety net fraud, halting billions of dollars in Medicaid funding to states like California and Minnesota.
And freezing the entire national Medicare hospice enrollment system, literally denying care to terminally ill patients, all to force state-level compliance.
Which leaves a deeply provocative final thought regarding the structure of the American Republic. As the federal government increasingly abandons incremental policy in favor of massive financial leverage, whether it is funding corporate nuclear energy, barring access to workforce grants, or cutting off critical Medicaid funding to force compliance on immigration and safety standards.
We are witnessing the ultimate stress test of federalism.
Yeah. When Washington, D.C. acts simultaneously as the primary financier of the corporate industrial base and the punitive auditor of the state's social safety net, how long can individual states maintain any semblance of independent sovereignty?
Does the sheer, overwhelming power of the federal purse eventually override the constitutional architecture of the state?
That is the defining question hidden within the text of these executive orders and judicial dissents. We want to thank you for joining us as we explored the mechanisms behind these policies. Keep reading past the headlines, keep analyzing the real-world impact behind the stated intent, and keep questioning the structures shaping your reality.